So the first speaker during our first plenary session about the future of the non-proliferation regime and arms control would be Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Mr. Sergey Ryabkov. Mr. Ryabkov, over to you. Thank you very much, dear Anton. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, obviously I'm extremely pleased and honored to be given a chance to speak to such an illustrious audience, especially given the fact that the relevance of the topic stated by the organizers is obvious to everybody. This relevance increases. Regretfully, we see a crisis and erosion of the basic principles that all the architecture of arms control and disarmament and non-proliferation was based. Those principles are many, but among them I'd like to emphasize mutual consideration of interests and leaning on binding agreements. Unfortunately, both, in many aspects, are becoming things of the past. In the interest of individual countries and groupings, effective international regimes are reshaped and agreements are scrapped. In such context, the future of the non-proliferation and arms control regime becomes less and less definite. Therefore, it is extremely important to demonstrate will and responsibility in order to find a common response or a common denominator in order to properly respond to the existing challenges. The Russian Federation pays special attention and attaches special significance to a successful delivery of the regular Ryabkov in 2020, most important international instrument in the non-proliferation and disarmament area. The outcomes of the Ryabkov will impact the key cooperation parameters in the area, at least for the next 5 years. In this connection, it is of principal importance for the Ryabkov to be held as constructive as possible, and all the parties to the treaty should make every possible effort to find mutually acceptable solutions. We understand that the level of contradictions is very high, and unfortunately, this level is not getting lower. Yet, we'd like all the conference participants to demonstrate restraint and concentrate on mutual interests. They should seek consensus, and among those interests of primary importance is maintaining and strengthening the nuclear arms non-proliferation regime. Now, to the extent the current situation allows, we should drop any mutual accusations. We should not come up with excessive demands. One important step to maintain the nuclear non-proliferation regime is to support the effectiveness of the CTBT. The responsibility for the CTBT not being effective so far, I think, rests with the 8 countries out of the list of 44 which have not ratified the treaty yet. In this context, we call upon the United States to change their decision spelled in the nuclear doctrine of this country, that is not to seek CTBT ratification. Such approach jeopardizes the treaty and renders its verification mechanism meaningless. We also think that it is of utmost importance to seek real progress in creating a zone free of weapons of mass destruction and their delivery means in the Middle East. I'd like to take this opportunity today and call upon representatives of all the relevant parties to take part in a conference that will take place in New York on November 18th through 22nd. The frameworks and modalities for this activity would allow to take into account relevant interests of all the interested parties, and there are no reasons to boycott this event. A few words about the regional non-proliferation dossier issues and situation around the JCPOA and the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. We think that the pullout of the United States from the JCPOA caused negative trends that are observed around those topics, including the most recent decision by Iran to start uranium enrichment at the Fordow facility to the level of 5%. All this makes political and diplomatic settlements extremely difficult. We hope that we'll be able to rekindle the dialogue on addressing the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. And obviously, this is where we hope that interaction between Pyongyang and Washington will become more active. On our part, we have been providing and will provide all the necessary assistance. Ladies and gentlemen, Russia consistently supports a broad dialogue aimed at maintaining strategic stability in all its aspects, taking into account all the factors that impact the stability in the current situation. We're very much concerned with the situation about the New START prospects. As you may know, START is due to expire in February 2021. This is the last of bilateral instruments in the strategic offensive arms control sphere. On many occasions, we expressed our readiness to address in earnest all the issues that may relate to its possible extension. In the current situation, the extension seems to be the only reasonable step that might prevent ultimate degradation of the strategic stability situation and avoid the collapse of the control and limit mechanisms in the nuclear and missile area, and buy some time to study approaches, including those to new military technologies and new armaments, and identify control mechanisms. In the recent years, the United States are talking a lot about this, but they do this without sufficient substance and dodge any substantive discussions. Besides, Washington obviously ignores our concerns related to the fulfillment of the obligation under the treaty by the United States, and they do not explain their plans as to a possible extension. The U.S. talk about new Russian armaments, new technologies that are not covered by the START treaty, the new technologies mentioned by President Putin. Well, it's impossible to deal with those technologies without revisiting and revising the treaty. The Americans forcefully state the need to engage China, that on many occasions identified its negative attitude to this. It seems that the U.S. dragging feet and trying to find a pretext to scrap the START treaty. If the START treaty is no longer effective, we will have no other mechanisms to limit offensive armaments. This year, we saw a demise of the INF Treaty. The ban on ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles with a range between 500 to 5,500 kilometers is also something that Washington is no longer happy with. They just dropped the treaty inventing some Russian violations. We haven't got any evidence, any substantiation of such accusations. And Americans rejected the Russian proposals regarding the steps that we believe could have supported viability of the treaty.
We were talking about a set of specific realistic measures that would address the concerns of both sides. Let me remind you that we had three groups of questions that we brought up with our conversation with Americans. We required explanations and clarifications that would be a part of compliance on the American side. Instead of continuing such a dialogue, Americans decided to withdraw from the treaty, and they rejected the idea of reciprocity. That is when the opportunity to save the treaty was lost. Russia is a responsible state, and we are not interested in new missile crisis. If we see further escalation of the crisis, that would be bad. We have made a decision to not deploy ground-based cruise missiles until the time when America deploys a similar type of vehicles. We called upon all countries to support our efforts to prevent deployment of new missile weapons in different parts of the world. We think that a similar step would make very good sense on the side of the United States and their allies. Ladies and gentlemen, I am speaking at this conference, and I must say that in many areas of arms control and non-proliferation, we see that the culture of a search for consensus is lost. We see that there are attempts to impose certain solutions that serve interests of only some parties. I think that this is a very dangerous trend. The diplomatic community, politicians, those people who care about international security and stability should address the substantive part of agreements and treaties. They should work further on strengthening international security. Without that, in 1 or 2 years, we could end up in a situation that would be even more difficult than what we're having today. It's very important not to allow that to happen. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ryabkov. Our next presenter is Director General at Department of Arms Control and Disarmament at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of China, Ambassador Fu Cong.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a pleasure and honor to attend this important seminar. So the topic for this session is the future of arms control and non-proliferation regime. So I will concentrate my remarks on this issue. Currently, the international arms control and non-proliferation regime is at a critical crossroads due to the following reasons. First, the global strategic stability architecture is under duress, with the collapse or near collapse of the bilateral arms control agreements between the US and Russia. Second, great power rivalry is coming back with a vengeance, with the US trying to contain and seek overwhelming military superiority over Russia and China in all fields and with all means imaginable, and even introducing political ideology into the international discourse on arms control and non-proliferation, which will lead to heightened risks of arms race and even confrontation. Third, unilateralism is becoming the order of the day for the US, which willfully withdraws from both bilateral and multilateral arms control and non-proliferation agreements and impose unilateral sanctions with extraterritorial restrictions in violation of international law. Fourth, advances in emerging technologies bring about new security challenges, and the absence of international rules in these new domains is becoming increasingly prominent. So in my view, the future of the international arms control and non-proliferation regime depends on whether we are able to properly address the challenges brought about by these dangerous trends. In this connection, China would like to propose the following. First, we need to recognize the indivisibility of security and adopt a concept of common security. The main contradiction confronting the international arms control and non-proliferation efforts is one between multilateralism and unilateralism, not one between the so-called democracies or non-democracies, as some US officials wish us to believe. China advocates a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security concept. Respect for each other's legitimate security concerns, and fostering a regional and a global security environment in which all countries feel safe will help reduce the motivations for an arms race and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Secondly, we must maintain the global strategic stability. The famous motto that a nuclear war cannot be won and thus must never be fought should be reaffirmed by all nuclear weapon states. Such doctrines and practices as the preemptive use of nuclear weapons, expanding the scope of nuclear deterrence, launch on warning, and the development of low-yield nuclear warheads need to be stopped. The US should stop the development and deployment of its global missile defense system. The New START between the US and Russia should be extended. We urge the two nuclear superpowers to further reduce their nuclear weapons, both deployed and in stockpile, so as to create conditions for other nuclear weapon states to participate in nuclear arms reduction negotiations. Thirdly, we must enhance dialogue on nuclear doctrines. The more complicated the international security environment gets, the more urgent is the need for more dialogue on nuclear doctrines between nuclear weapon states, so as to avoid accidents and crises triggered by strategic misjudgment or miscalculation. Nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states should also strengthen communication for the ultimate goal of achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. An international legal instrument on negative security assurances to all nuclear weapon states should be negotiated as soon as possible, which will go a long way towards reducing nuclear risks. Fourthly, we must promote political and diplomatic solutions of regional proliferation issues. Imposition of unilateral sanctions in violation of international law should be resisted, and trying to gain geopolitical advantages in the name of non-proliferation must be opposed. The JCPOA, which was endorsed by the UN Security Council, should be implemented fully and effectively. The denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula will contribute to regional peace and security. Parties concerned should take concrete actions to maintain the momentum of dialogue and the easing of tension on the peninsula. Efforts should also be made to achieve progress on the establishment of a Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction. Fifthly, we should uphold the authority of multilateral arms control regime. All states should make efforts to safeguard the international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation architecture with the NPT as its cornerstone, and work for positive outcomes of the 2020 NPT Review Conference. We should maintain the authority and effectiveness of the existing multilateral disarmament machinery, such as the UN and the Conference on Disarmament. Trying to create small groups or even exclusive clubs can only be detrimental to the existing mechanisms. Multilateral arms control agreements must be upheld. The universality of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Arms Trade Treaty, ATT, need to be promoted. The Chemical Weapons Convention should be fully implemented, and obligations under the Convention to destroy existing stockpiles of chemical weapons and the abandoned chemical weapons need to be fulfilled in good faith and in time. Furthermore, we should reject any practice of double standard and work to establish a more open and inclusive global export control and non-proliferation regime. Finally, we must regulate the military applications of the emerging technologies. The rapid development of technologies in outer space, biology, cyberspace, and artificial intelligence has brought about complicated and profound impacts on global security and strategic stability. An urgent task facing the arms control community is to establish necessary norms and rules for the military applications of these emerging technologies, while respecting and safeguarding the rights of all states in their peaceful uses. The international community should be firmly opposed to the weaponization of outer space and commence negotiation at the CD on a legally binding instrument at an early stage, at an early date, so as to prevent an arms race in outer space. A verification protocol to the Biological Weapons Convention, BWC, should be negotiated, and a code of conduct for biological scientific research and other activities needs to be worked out as soon as possible. Cyberspace should be used for peace and for the well-being of all people. Efforts should be made to prevent cyber warfare or an arms race in cyberspace. And we should also resist any attempt to abuse the concept of national security for the purpose of unfairly restricting normal international cooperation in the field of information technology. The security risks, as well as the legal, ethical, and moral issues associated with the military applications of the artificial intelligence, should be fully recognized and evaluated, and the necessary preventive measures need to be taken. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by saying a few words about China. China is a defender of the international order, rather than a revisionist power labeled by the US. China is not interested in power politics or power games. China never seeks hegemony and has no intention of joining any arms race with any country. China will continue to follow the path of peaceful development and unswervingly pursue a defensive nuclear strategy. In the meantime, China will stand with the majority of the international community by firmly advocating multilateralism, by preserving and enhancing the international arms control and non-proliferation regime, and by safeguarding the global strategic stability for the interest of international peace and security. Thank you.
Спасибо, посол Фуцун.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fu Cong. Our next presenter is Undersecretary General, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs in the United Nations, Mrs. Izumi Nakamitsu. I would like to use this opportunity and say thank you to the Disarmament Affairs Office and your partnership in this conference. Over to you, ma'am.
Anton, it's a real pleasure to be in Moscow for this very important conference for the second time. I think this has really become one of an important gathering of international actors looking at those quite important issues related to international peace and security. Let me start. I don't have a prepared presentation as such, but I would like to start out with our analysis of where the world is in terms of international security architecture, and then sort of start moving on to the future, the new visions, etc. I really very much appreciate these futuristic discussions. I think that's what we really want to start reflecting on. As my esteemed previous speakers, Deputy Minister Ryabkov and Ambassador Hu Kon, it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with you. As they have already painted, we are actually in a very dire situation when it comes to international security environment. Let me quote the Secretary General from this year's General Assembly remark. He said, across the global landscape, we see conflicts persisting, terrorism spreading, and the risk of a new arms race growing. It's very clear that we share the analysis that the geostrategic conflict today, context today, is defined by distrust, militarization, if you will, of international relations, and also a clear lack of dialogue, which is quite worrying. I think the second important element that we see around us, and this is at the heart of a deteriorating international relations also, is the rules-based international order, including disarmament and non-proliferation regime, is being challenged. It is a very serious challenge that is that we see on those instruments that we have created, using many decades of international efforts. That includes, obviously, erosion of the bilateral arrangements, agreements between the United States and the Russian Federation. These are, as we speak, being eroded. The third element, I think, is very important for us to really understand is that there is now a multipolar nuclear order. They are no longer, the world that we live in is no longer just a bipolar order. So there are very serious nuclear challenges that are emerging. It's been already mentioned that the Middle East is one such region, also the Korean Peninsula, but also I would include South Asia. So I think it is very important for us to take a look at the proliferation threats in different regions, which will, of course, because it is nuclear, this will impact at the global level. It's also quite difficult for us to tackle. That is the proliferation of delivery vehicles, the missiles. It doesn't have a global regime. There are efforts being done on a voluntary norm making, but I think missiles and delivery vehicles issues is one of the key issues that we are actually looking at when it comes to current international environment, but also going into the future. And then the fourth, which has been already mentioned by Ambassador Hu Kon, is the new technologies and the impact that brings. The cyberspace is a new domain, land, air, space, and then now we have a fourth domain called cyberspace. I would agree very much that the new domain will have to be a domain for peace rather than warfare. But it is a real challenge that is really in front of us. All these things combined, I think there are now questions being put. The sort of classical, traditional concept of strategic stability, what does that mean in the 21st century? They seem to be new vulnerabilities, especially because of the new technologies, the risk of hacking, spoofing third parties with malicious intent. It's not just a state issue, but it's also non-state actors, all these things potentially opening up new vulnerabilities. And then all these things combined, where we look at the most serious danger is the potentially lowered barriers to use of nuclear weapons. And that, I think, is something that we really need to tackle jointly. So against this background of increased or deteriorated international relations, I think there is an emerging consensus that there might be, in fact, a need for a new vision in arms control and disarmament. We hear that from all corners. The substance of a new vision might be very different from where they are talking about. But I think there is a recognition that we need to think about what might be new approaches that we need that is fit for purpose for the 21st century. So the Secretary General, I think many of you know that the Secretary General actually included this point in his speech to the Conference on Disarmament earlier this year in February, that indeed there is a new vision for disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. What would it look like? We don't know exactly. I think we are still at nascent stages of answering this question. And we are aware that it would take some time to articulate. And therefore, my first message in terms of a future or the immediate future is to try and make sure that we preserve existing gains in disarmament and arms control. We obviously have to try to preserve the bilateral reductions of the past 30 years or so, from 70,000 arsenals to some 14,000. You have actually made enormous progress, so let's try to preserve that. We absolutely also need to ensure the viability and the relevance of the NPT. We have a bigger opportunity coming up in the spring next year, 2020, at the Ryabkov, which also coincides with the 20th year anniversary of the entry into force of that treaty. And then, of course, try to make sure that unfinished business, that is CTBT entry into force, and also starting the negotiation as soon as possible on the FMCT. So this is the sort of basic immediate action that I think, looking at the United Nations point of view, these are very important. So what might be foundations, if you will, of a new vision? Let me suggest a few. Number one, from where I sit, it will be extremely important that this new vision, whatever that might be in details, should be based on the norm of a non-use of nuclear weapons, and also again, reaffirming our joint and shared objective of elimination of nuclear weapons. So the normative aspect of it is quite important. The second, I think, we have so many of disarmament arms control experts here. Any new vision really need to be also grounded in the principles of verifiability, irreversibility, and transparency. And I would add, very importantly, accountability and also enforcement. Compliance, I think, has to be really important features of any new vision. The third, of course, the security concerns really should be taken into account. It's very important. But also, there has to be clear understanding that disarmament is not about creating a utopian world, but it is actually about a key, it's a tool, an instrument, a key measure to prevent, also mitigate, and resolve conflict. In other words, closer linkage between disarmament and political efforts related to preventing, mitigating, and also resolving conflict. We need to actually have a little bit more holistic understandings. I think it should also seek the fourth element, to reestablish good faith dialogue and negotiations in a substantive and civil manner. And then the fifth, very important for the United Nations, it has to also be in line with the protection of civilians principles. Indeed, it has to really strengthen measures for how we might be able to better protect civilians as well. Now, just a couple of potential elements which I would like to suggest. I think, the traditionally disarmament and arms control has been very much driven by a number of arsenals. I think it will be quite important also to start looking at capabilities of different weapons rather than just looking at the numerical aspects of it. The second, of course, we all know it, but there is a blurring lines between strategic and conventional weapons. We need to actually look at those lines between these different categories of weapons because of all the new technologies, etc., that has already been mentioned. And from that point of view, we think it should really look at and highlight the risks posed by especially dangerous weapons, such as hypersonic weapons, nuclear-armed drones, God forbid, weapons also designed to attack civilian infrastructures. The fourth point, potential elements, I already articulated a little bit, strengthen regional approaches to disarmament, including through development of confidence-building measures at different regions. We need to have a regionally tailored approach. The fifth, enhanced transparency about new weapon systems, including enhanced implementation of national weapons reviews. We already have a mechanism under CCW. I think we need to utilize some of those possible instruments that we have at hand so that, again, make sure that our new arms control be fit for purpose in the 21st century. Address sensitive issue of anti-missile systems, especially ballistic missile defense. We all know the sensitivities on this issue, but I think we need to recognize that despite nascent capabilities in this sphere, fears about future deployments is really deep, and somehow we need to think about that. The seventh, I already also mentioned, long overdue issue of missiles. This is one of the key issues, I think, that will have an impact also at the strategic stability issues. But also, I would add from the UN's point of view, civilian protections. And eighth, and a final point in a potential element, I cannot fail to emphasize the importance of gendered impact in different weapon systems. I think it is now becoming an increasingly important issue and recognized as such. So let me wrap up. When we actually look at those new elements, what are the processes that we need? What might be the steps? I think we need to once again stress the importance of a primary responsibility of states in making all these considerations. But I would also like to emphasize that in the new century, 21st century, norm making and discussions related to those issues will have to become much more multi-stakeholder. In fact, the Russian Federation took a very important initiative in the cyberspace where you actually proposed to have, for the first time at the United Nations, the multi-stakeholder conference. We're now preparing for that in December, early December. But I think that kind of a multi-stakeholder engagement that will include technical communities, but also younger people, civil society, academia, all these people and entities that can really bring different perspectives really need to be involved in the discussions on those new areas. Finally, I think in this context, of course, the traditional legally binding instruments, negotiations will remain very important. But I think we also need to think about what are the kinds of other instruments that can be really important. Self-regulation, transparency and confidence building, political declaration, all these things actually together, combined together, actually make an enormous impact in how we actually make up international peace and security and architecture and the regime. So let's try to have a broad spectrum of understandings. And I really hope that younger people, the parliamentarians, women, will also take part in those things. And then we are ready to also play a role as the United Nations to convene those different actors. And we are looking at very difficult, but I would say very important efforts that we jointly need to make in the years to come. Thank you.
Спасибо, госпожа Nakamitsu.
Thank you, Madam Nakamitsu. We've heard from three speakers, three exciting, rich presentations. I'm sure we've got a lot of food for thought. Since all the three distinguished speakers used up a little bit more time than I had allotted them, let us go ahead with the feedback and comments from the floor. But before we do, let me mention that since we mentioned the U.S. on several occasions during the presentations, in the course of many years, we've tried to invite colleagues from the State Departments responsible for relevant topics. I had a series of meetings in New York last year. Last week we talked about this in Washington, but unfortunately our American colleagues decided to dodge the discussion in this format, which is a shame. And I think it just underscores the kind of situation we see in Washington today with respect to our agenda. However, for all the issues, for all the topics we include into our agenda, including arms control and disarmament, we'd be happy to have key players present in our discussion. So now let's go ahead with the Q&A and comments. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question or make a comment. We've got two microphones in the room. Dr. Kozin goes first, then Dr. Lewis, please. Thank you. Vladimir Kozin, corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences and Natural Sciences. I've got a question to you, Madam Nakamitsu. You gave us a very detailed yet brief account of the 8 points of the new UN vision and your office vision. Now, I wonder if you plan to come up with a very detailed report on this new vision with respect to arms control. Something like the UN used to do in the past. I remember very good reports on naval arms race and so on. I would not give you the whole list of those reports. Now, such a report, such a detailed paper, thick paper, I think, would make a very good impression. Thank you very much. Now, I suggest we get some 4 or 5 questions, and then we'll allow our speakers to respond. Patricia, over to you.
Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. Thank you to all of the speakers. So I wanted to address one of, I think, the hardest problems that was implicit but not explicit in the discussions. And it's the issue of how nuclear deterrence works with nuclear disarmament and the inherent conflict that we have. So how do we eliminate nuclear weapons when nuclear weapons are characterized as being fundamental for deterring conflict, for deterring escalation in conflict? And is it possible for us to address this issue in the non-proliferation context in a way that could move us forward as opposed to keeping us paralyzed? Thank you.
Sig Hacker and Bill Potter, next 2 questions, then we'll give the floor to speakers to react.
Thank you, Anton, and thank you, distinguished panel. I'm Sergey Hecker from Stanford University, and many years at Los Alamos National Laboratory. I must confess, I find it somewhat painful as an American sitting here and to have all of the world's problems, blamed on the United States. And it strikes me, even though it turns out in the current U.S. government, I sit here and I said, yes, we deserve, a lot of that criticism. However, it lets you off the hook too easily from Russia and China, because you can just say, well, it's the Americans' fault. And that was clearly what was pointed out here. And certainly as I look back over my many years in this business, I found sort of American governments tend to swing, from left or right. We just had a president who was really serious about trying to get to a world without nuclear weapons. We have a different president now. But so I find it too easy, for example, on the Russian side, to talk about low-yield nuclear weapons on the American side, when I see Russia developing weapons that I really consider extremely dangerous. Hypersonic with nuclear weapons, combining a nuclear reactor with a nuclear warhead, or doing the underwater drones. And so how can one not talk about those issues as also having greatly affected the overall international climate?
Thank you, Sik, and I like your, sustainability in your points, because you made exactly the same point in China 2 weeks ago that changed Russia and China, the places in your statement. Thank you. Bill.
Bill Potter, I direct the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey. I was struck by Ambassador Fu Cong's statement and really call for all nuclear weapons states to reiterate in some fashion the principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. And I know all of the panelists have, in one way or another, also raised that issue. Izumi, I know you encouraged a discussion of that a year ago and even suggested perhaps a ministerial statement on that topic might be appropriate in advance of the 2020 review conference. I know the Russian Federation communicated a note to the United States last fall also on that theme. And most recently at the 2019 NPT PrepCom, China alone on the floor of the PrepCom encouraged the chair to include in his factual summary reference to that. Yet we see really no traction, at least I observe no traction. And so I would be interested if the panelists believe that there indeed is some prospect for some variant of that formula to be put forward that could be embraced both by nuclear weapon states and endorsed in one fashion or another at the review conference.
Спасибо. Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Now I will give a chance to our speakers to respond. But while they respond, please check the mics so that we have decent sound when people ask questions. And then get the mics ready for the next round of questions. Dr. Sultan, Dr. Santoro. Now, your responses.
For Tsun and Deputy for Mr. Ryabkov.
Okay. Should I respond to all four?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So the first, I think Dr. Krizin was the first question about a new vision, whether the UN will issue a report. Well, first of all, these elements, I put 8, but probably there are more than 8 by no order of preference, I just pointed out. This not actually not a UN vision as such. These are the kinds of things that I'm hearing from different parts of the world. I don't think it would be sufficient that the UN will actually put a new vision. To me, this is very much an issue that international community as a whole really needs to reflect upon. So the UN's role is, again, to provide platform for such discussions if that is deemed useful, and potentially also contribute with the research, with the dialogue platforms, etc. We might have some written pieces, but in fact we are already in individual aspects, some of them we're already issuing useful research and useful papers and reports. Hypersonic weapons, we had a joint report between UNIDIR and UNODA, etc. So we are very much at the moment in the process of consulting and getting sort of temperatures, we're gauging temperatures from different member states and different experts. And as of now, I hear a lot of interest by many countries that yes, indeed, we need to start reflecting on those new vision and start thinking about what might be different elements and deepening discussions, etc. Patricia's question about deterrence, indeed, I think it is something that you cannot avoid. I personally don't believe that the UN is the platform to discuss deterrence, not least because we will probably not have any impact on those kinds of issues, hardcore security issues. But I always encourage member states and different experts to actually start looking at linkage between disarmament and deterrence issues. And I think it is, again, gaining traction. I understand that UNIDIR, our research institution, autonomous, independent institution within the UN system, might actually have a research project on that. But I think many different institutions are now looking at the linkage between deterrence and nuclear disarmament, which I think is very encouraging. Professor Hecker, I hope you didn't think I was pointing finger at the United States. In fact, for us, US really is a partner, and it has to be a partner. After all, it is one of the military and nuclear superpowers. So we need to work with the United States, and I do believe I am working quite closely with the United States. Maybe this will be too impolite, but I think indeed it takes two to tango. I think that's the phrase. We need to restore sincere dialogue between those different parties. We need to make sure that the dialogues will be substantive. I know that, for example, the P5 dialogues are continuing, which is encouraging. You made enormous efforts in that. But I think those dialogues will have to be much more substantive. And in order for that to happen, there will have to be sincere efforts on all parties that the dialogues, first and foremost, will need to be civil, sincere, and therefore it could be substantive. Bill, yes, I will keep trying. The Secretary General will continue to try. It doesn't have to be, of course, exactly how Reagan-Gorbachev statements actually capture that. But any reference to even we don't want nuclear war kind of a statement, any statement capturing the gist of what Reagan-Gorbachev stated will be useful political input into the RAPCON next year. I would very much like this non-use principle to be reaffirmed by all P5. And I think if they can go a little bit beyond that, that will be a huge political significance for the nuclear NPT RAPCON that we are now really starting to prepare for. The clock is ticking. We need some positive input into that RAPCON.
Thank you. Ambassador Fu.
Thank you. So first, let me answer Patricia's question on deterrence versus nuclear disarmament. I would like to say the following. First, let me say that China supports the goal of having a world free of nuclear weapons. And actually, China is one of the first countries to make that proposition early in the 1960s. And that remains our goal. And secondly, I want to say that when it comes to the nuclear disarmament, our view is that we need to take a pragmatic approach. And so we cannot achieve a world free of nuclear weapons overnight. So it has to be done step by step. And in our view, the first step is for the US and Russia to continue to reduce their nuclear weapons, because their nuclear arsenals are so huge, so much bigger than the nuclear arsenals of other nuclear weapon states. It is only natural that these two countries reduce their nuclear weapons first. And so that's why we urge US and Russia to maintain, to extend their START treaty, New START treaty, and then on that basis continue earnest dialogue to further reduce that. And having said that, China is not shying away from our own responsibilities. We have said repeatedly, once the two nuclear superpowers have reduced their nuclear arsenals to a level comparable to China's nuclear arsenal, China will be happy to join the negotiation. But it is unrealistic to expect China to join the so-called tripartite negotiation at this stage. And also, actually, when it comes to the nuclear disarmament, we should not also lose sight of the efforts made in other forums. For instance, in the multilateral fora, like the P5 and like a very useful discussion at the CD, and also we also have multilateral treaties like the CTBT and others. So we think all this constitutes a part of the international efforts that moves towards nuclear disarmament. And the third point I want to make is that I want to emphasize the importance of the nuclear risk reduction. I think that is very important, and that also partly answers the question of nuclear deterrence. In our view, it is important that the P5, the nuclear weapon states, need to engage in a continuous dialogue on their nuclear doctrines, on their nuclear strategies, and we have always believed that it is important to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the strategies of nuclear weapon states. And for us, no first use is a viable option. And in our view, if all countries, if all nuclear weapon states commit themselves not to be the first to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances, I think that by itself will constitute, in my personal view, a very important part of nuclear disarmament, because that will lead to a lot of concrete measures to accommodate or to put this strategy into practice. And before the total elimination of nuclear weapons, I think what can make a better sense than for the 5 nuclear weapon states commit themselves not to be the first nuclear weapons. By that, we can reduce the role of nuclear weapons in the national strategy to the minimum. And that will actually lead to concrete measures if countries really implement that strategy. So once again, we believe that that's extremely important, a proposition that people should not forget. On Dr. Potter's comments on the famous motto that nuclear war cannot be one that should not be fought. Indeed, China is one of the 5 countries that are advocating this. But I need to be fair with other countries as well. I think among the P5, this has been a subject for discussion among the P5 for quite some time now. My understanding of the discussion is that the P4, Russia, UK, and France, they have agreed to reiterate this, maybe with some verification of the wording, but the essence, the P4 have agreed. It is only the US, surprisingly, that is against reaffirmation of this important idea. And for us, this is a very serious, we take this issue very seriously, because the US, on the one hand, rejects the reaffirmation of this. And at the same time, they also reject even the concept of strategic stability. If you add these two things with what the US has been doing according to its NPR, like the developing the low threshold, the low yield nuclear warheads, and also the about their if you also look at them or look at what they are doing in terms of the missile defense system, and also their advocacy of putting weapons into the space that can launch preemptive strikes on the ground. I think if you put all these things together, I think this paints a very dangerous picture for other countries. So what the US is trying to do is to disrupt the strategic stability and to seek extremely destabilizing military capabilities that that will undermine, even offset the nuclear capabilities of other countries. I think that is a very dangerous move, and that by itself will lead to a heightened risk of a nuclear arms race. And on Dr. Hacker's question about Russian capabilities, of course, I will leave that to the minister to answer, but I will just say one thing. As an observer from the outside, observing the debates between Russia and the US, my observation is that the Russians have taken actions in response to what the Russians have been doing, especially taken measures that can defeat the missile defense system. I think that is the point, that is the prism, I would say, from which we perceive the situation or the debate between Russia and the US.
Thank you, Ambassador Fu. Sergey Alexeyevich.
Thank you. First on nuclear deterrence and non-proliferation. Risks for non-proliferation are associated not least with the temptation that is visible in some circles to go nuclear in order to ensure an ultimate security policy for a country, especially countries that find themselves in troubling regions. We strongly oppose this trend, although we recognize that it cannot be easily countered through political and diplomatic means if not the political will in sufficient measure is present. We strongly urge the so-called P5 countries to come together and focus on these risks for non-proliferation regime, because this, proliferation of ideas that somehow nuclear weaponization may ensure a better and stronger security for some in a current very tumultuous and unpredictable world. We do think that this would be one of the issues to continuously put into agendas of appropriate international formats, including P5, where the rotating coordination moved from China. And I use the opportunity to echo Dr. Nakamitsu in complimenting the Chinese for what they have done in the course of this one-year rotating presidency, allowing people to talk freely, giving sufficient time also on exchanging on things like nuclear doctrines. But well beyond this, we expect the UK presidency to follow suit and look into it with due recognition of a changing environment in these and other areas. On doctrines, we do discuss this if and when we meet officially with the US. We do not have a firm schedule as of now what will happen further, at least at my level or at a level lower than mine. But on the margins of different international events and different gatherings, we, of course, clearly discuss things with the US counterparts, including on the future of arms control and non-proliferation. On the phrase which was coined by Reagan and Gorbachev, indeed, we would welcome the US acceptance of reissuance of such a statement in relation also to some new developments, including technological ones, new threats and challenges. We say them, take your time, have a look. We understand it's a serious issue. We are in no hurry, although I would say that an absence of such a message begins to, add some uncertainty also in the international membership and in international public. So hopefully by the time when we arrive at the next year NPT review conference, then it would be possible at this format as well to reconfirm this commitment. We are gratified that a few days ago the first committee, which is still going on in New York, and we don't know what will happen next year, but this year it's in New York. There we were able to approve a resolution, a unanimous resolution favoring strengthening of the international arms control arrangements. I thank all the countries for goodwill and open mind that allowed to do so. On new types, Anton, I know I am too boring, but I cannot but answer what Ambassador Fu told me to tell with full respect. Yes, I need to refer to President Putin once again, who publicly explained very clearly that the arrival of the new types happened because the US administration, at that time George W. Bush administration, was not able to cooperate in a manner that would strengthen security on ABM-related issues. The US withdrawal from ABM treaty and subsequent continuous drive towards development and deployment of a global ABM system created a situation where there was no other way for us but to do what we did. So at this point in time, we told the US that the two new types will be definitely covered by the START treaty. If at the moment when those two types will eventually become operational, the treaty will be still in force. On the three others, we told the US we are open for dialogue, separate from the START and start review arrangements, but a dialogue dealing with all issues of relation to strategic stability. In translation, in a more straightforward way of offering this, it means that we expect US to agree to discussing things like missile defense, like deployments in space, and other things negatively affecting the strategic stability. If the US is not prepared for this, then there will be no dialogue on three other new types, as simple as that.
Thank you. We have time just for 4 final questions. First, Dr. Sultan, then Dr. Santaro, Academician Rogov, and Mr. Einhorn. I apologize that we are not able to pick all questions. Please.
Thank you, Anton. Dr. Maria Sultan from South Asian Strategic Stability Institute, Pakistan. First of all, I would like to say that it's heartening to hear that the panel believes in multilateralism and that it is the key to national and international security. But my question is that how do you see the actual value of multilateralism where the instruments, the multilateral instruments, are failing to provide any kind of tangible support to threats which are emanating on international security. Two cases here in point. One is, of course, the situation in Kashmir, where 7 million people have been impounded for 90 days, and there is a unilateral action through which the basic article of the UN Article 1 has been set aside, let alone anything else. And number two, we have seen in the case of JCPOA that while everybody believes in multilateralism, how do you respond to the US unilateralism? Is it just going to be conversations, or are we going to see the people who actually believe in this to take some concrete measures against the United States and for other revisionist powers to perhaps balance these threats? Or are we going to wait for actual nuclear exchanges in different regional hotspots to see that the world has to move concretely on disarmament?
Thank you. David Santoro next.
Thank you. David Santoro from Pacific Forum, based in Honolulu. Thank you, Anton and Dimitri, for the conference. Thank you to the panelists. My question is to Mr. Fu. In your comments, sir, you mentioned that China was counting on the US and Russia to move forward on nuclear reductions before other nuclear powers can join. And in your subsequent comments, you seem to suggest that China would be willing to actually take part in a trilateral arms control mechanism. So I'm just a little curious about China's position once nuclear reductions are made by the US and Russia. Is China willing to do trilateral arms control, or is the vision for a more multilateral form of arms control? Thank you.
Спасибо. Академик Рогов, сюда микрофон, пожалуйста.
Academician Rogov.
I'm Sergey Rogov from the Russian Academy of Sciences, and I have two questions to the Ambassador Futsun. I think, well, you explained very well why China rejected Donald Trump's proposal to join the nuclear arms negotiations with Russia and the United States, because there is a huge gap between the Chinese nuclear arsenal and Russian and American. But there is no gap, in my view, between nuclear arsenals of China and two other official nuclear weapon states, the United Kingdom and France. You have approximately the same number of nuclear weapons, and you also, well, don't rely on like Russia or the United States, you don't rely on the counter-force nuclear posture. And I wonder, maybe it's possible to have a different type of trilateral negotiations, different from what was just mentioned, between China, the United Kingdom, and France on their contribution to the process of arms control. I don't mean a legally binding treaty between those three countries. But what about their commitment to contribute by, for instance, declaring, as you mentioned, their commitment to the Gorbachev-Reagan formula of nuclear war? What about no first use? What about commitment not to build up? What about, well, commitment to make some limited, modest steps as far as transparency and confidence-building measures are concerned? And the second question about another trilateral negotiations, not with the United Kingdom and France. But as President Putin said, Russia is helping China to develop its early warning system. So, well, we can see that in the future there will be three countries, not two countries, but three countries which will possess early warning systems: the United States, Russia, and China. And as you remember, 20 years ago, Russia and the United States agreed to establish a joint center on missile launches. Unfortunately, this idea was never implemented. But is it possible to foresee a trilateral discussions between Russia, the United States, and China on cooperation in early warning, on exchange of information on missile launches, and measures which will really help to reduce the risks, which you emphasize, reduce the risks of the nuclear conflict. Thank you.
Bob Einhorn.
Thank you, Anton. I'm Bob Einhorn from the Brookings Institution in Washington. I just want to associate myself with the comment made by Sig Hecker. I'm glad you made that comment. I found the discussion a bit unbalanced. I know, Anton, you tried to get an official American presence and it wasn't possible, but I don't think this was the whole story. Two questions. First to Ambassador Fu. You said China doesn't intend to escape responsibility in this area of arms control. But then in the next sentence, you said that China is going to wait until the United States and Russia build down to China's level. I just don't think that cuts it. I don't think it's acceptable. Now, China is pursuing a very ambitious conventional and nuclear modernization program. It's deployed, a couple of thousand of medium and intermediate range missiles. There's a prospect of real instability and an arms race in East Asia. I think China has to play a more responsible role now and not 10 years from now if and when Russia and the United States build down. And specific question, why is China not prepared to engage in serious strategic stability talks with the United States? There have been a few very superficial meetings, but not serious. Why does China continue to rebuff U.S. requests in that area? And to Deputy Minister Ryabkov, you mentioned the Russian proposal for a moratorium on the deployment of land-based INF range missiles in Europe. But of course, the United States believes that Russia has already deployed INF range land-based missiles in Europe. How would you plan, if the U.S. took you up on this proposal, how would you plan to demonstrate to the United States that China does not already have an INF range missile in Europe? I'm sorry, I'm thinking of China. How would you demonstrate that concretely?
Thank you, Bob. 4 questions, and each of the panelists will have 1 minute to respond, because the rule is very simple. The longer speak people who ask questions, less time those who have to answer have. And I will give the floor in reverse order. So, Ms. Nakamitsu, I will ask you to react first, then Ambassador Fu, and then Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov. Ms. Nakamitsu, if you would like to react to any question, please.
Well, I only had one easier but very difficult questions related to multilateralism. My reaction would be the following. Number one, I think multilateralism is under huge pressure, but at the same time, during the high-level week of a General Assembly, there are increasing, number of highest-level government officials coming to the UN to actually stress the importance of multilateralism. And it's natural because many of the issues that are confronting us can only be resolved through multilateral discussions. I mean, the science and technology-related issues, case in point. Number two, the reasons why multilateralism is under such a strain, such a stress, is not because of unilateralism. I see that unilateralism is actually is a symptom of a problem, not the cause of pressure on multilateralism. What I mean is that we also need to make sure that today's multilateralism will actually produce some solutions. In other words, a huge number of people who actually became really disillusioned by international organizations, international multilateral processes, were also behind a shift, rather quick shift in 2015-16. Soon after the SDG adopted and Paris Climate Agreement adopted in 2015, it started to change in many Western countries and started to say no to multilateral cooperation because they felt really left out from the benefits of globalization and multilateralism. So we really need to fundamentally review what multilateralism can produce. And that's why we need to take advantage of next year's 75th anniversary of the foundation of the United Nations. Our theme is the future of multilateralism. So indeed, I guess my answer to Dr. Sultan's question is that we need to start really reflecting on how to make sure that multilateralism will remain effective and relevant and produce some of the solutions, including in arms control and disarmament areas.
Thank you. Ambassador Futon.
First, let me answer the question related to this trilateral negotiation. I would like to make the following point. First, yes, indeed, the US has made so much noise about having this trilateral negotiations. But let me make it clear. So far, until now, the US has never told us what exactly they want to talk about in this trilateral dialogue, in this trilateral negotiation. This is point number one. And secondly, I don't think it is realistic or even reasonable to expect China to participate in an arms reduction negotiation with US and Russia. I think that is the point that we are all experts here, so I don't think that is difficult to understand, given the huge gap between China's arsenal and that of the US and Russia. Unless the US wants to reduce its nuclear arsenals to the level of the Chinese arsenal, or agree for China to raise its level to the US arsenal. So I don't think that is even, I think it is disingenuous, first and foremost, of the US even to talk about this trilateral negotiation or asking China to join US and Russia in an arms reduction dialogue. And I think this is nothing more than a diversion and nothing more than a red herring, if that is the correct word, because in our view, this is no more than a pretext so that the US can withdraw from another important international treaty. And the third point I want to make is that we do believe that the two nuclear superpowers need to continue with the reduction because both of them have over 6,000 nuclear warheads, and it's too many, far too many. I think it's important that they continue to do that. When I say that China would join them when they reduce to the comparable level, and that is our position, but it doesn't mean that China is just sitting there idly and doing nothing. So that comes to my fourth question. China has never, let me repeat, China has never rejected the so-called meaningful dialogue with anybody. Actually, among the P5, China was the country to initiate this dialogue on doctrines, which has been welcomed internationally. And we believe that this is talking about the contribution that the medium-sized nuclear weapons can make. We believe that this is one of the areas that the countries like China, UK, and Russia should contribute. We need to make our doctrines more clear, and in order to remove any possible misunderstandings. And when it comes to the bilateral dialogue, frankly, we do have a mechanism. And you talk about superficial. I don't know how deep can you go and how do you define superficial. But there is a mechanism at the vice ministerial level on arms control and strategic stability. And let me say this. The US new administration has never, not for once, asked China to resume this dialogue. China stands ready to continue. Frankly, it is the Chinese who actually asked the US. Me personally, during the first committee of this year, I went to Robert Wood. I said, can we have a dialogue on nuclear arms control issues? Well, she said, sure, but I'm too busy. So there was no meeting. And so China is not rejecting any meaningful dialogue with anybody. And I think that is a point we need to bear in mind. And actually, when it comes to the dialogue, Chris Ford came to Beijing in July. We had a very meaningful dialogue on non-proliferation. You can go and ask Chris whether that dialogue was meaningful or not. And actually, in next month, China and the US are having this dialogue on the nuclear security and safety issues. So the dialogues, the mechanisms are there. So China is very active. And also in terms of the multilateral discussions, I'm sure you know as well as I do that in the CD we had discussions, and China is the one who has been advocating that we should have a negotiation on the negative security assurances. It's the US who rejects even to set up a subsidiary body on issues like this. Now, who is rejecting meaningful dialogue? So I think having this so-called trilateral without any definition of what exactly they mean by this, and then talk about meaningful dialogue or lack of meaningful dialogue because of the Chinese objection, I don't think that is genuine, let me put it mildly. And I think that it's nothing more than a red herring. On the
very short, please.
Very short. On the INF, I need to answer this question on INF. Frankly, I don't think that the Chinese capability of nuclear medium-range missiles is destabilizing. Let me say this, that our missiles are based on our own territory. So they do not pose threat to the US unless and until they get too close to the Chinese shores with their warships. I think that is the point people need to bear in mind. And also, but the US, almost immediately after the demise of the INF Treaty, they start testing their capabilities, the land-based missiles. So that shows, talking about China not being party to this treaty and therefore the US needs to withdraw is nothing more than a pretext, frankly. And also, and then immediately after the demise of the INF, the defense secretary of the US came to Asia Pacific, talk about deployment. Sooner rather than later, I'm quoting him. And what does that mean? And they are talking about the forward deployment of the land-based intermediate-range missile virtually on the Chinese doorstep. China is facing our own capabilities on our own territory. We pose no threat. But the US is talking about basing their intermediate-range missiles on the doorsteps of China, which will directly endanger high-value targets. We put all these high-value targets within the range of all these missiles. And then some experts even say this will endanger the survivability of the Chinese nuclear forces. So these are extremely provocative and destabilizing acts. So I don't agree that China's missiles are being destabilizing. So that point,
I have to interrupt you at that point because we do need time for the final.
I hope the people get the
comments
point.
by Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov and Foreign Minister Lavrov on his way.
Sure.
Sergey Alexeyevich, пожалуйста.
On moratorium, to Dr. Einhorn, it is not a proposed moratorium. It's a moratorium that there is in place since February 2, and what was communicated to US and other NATO member states was that we would welcome that these countries join and declare the very same arrangement to refrain from deployment of INF systems. Our moratorium is valid until and unless US starts to deploy such systems anywhere, and it's not associated only with Europe or the area associated with NATO. Number two, we have never received any corroboration on the part of the US on our missile 9M729 which was used as a pretext for the US unilateral withdrawal from INF Treaty. In the course of discussions with the US for several years, we have received references to some activities which we undertook at our testing ground at Kapustin Yar, but we faithfully and in great detail responded to each and every single message from the US to this end. Contrary to this, US was never able to provide not only any clarification how they respond or react to our accusations on a triple non-compliance by the US with the INF Treaty, which was a long-standing one in each and every part of it, but were never able ever to engage in a dialogue how to resolve these issues. Moreover, after the test fire launch of a cruise missile from Universal Launcher Mk-41, 16 days after the history with the INF Treaty was over, the US quietly told us that it was not about 9M729, but about something else and different. We even didn't ask what and how was it, because it's completely irrelevant. The US wanted to destroy INF Treaty because it constrained its build-up in this area for reasons unrelated and with no connection with Russian activities in regard to 9M729, which is deployed and which is operational, but this is not an intermediate-range cruise missile.
Спасибо, Сергей Алексеевич. На этом наступило время завершать.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryabkov. This is time to wrap up our first session. I am glad that we have some positive emotions in our discussions. Emotions are always good to find the truth. Let us say thank you to our panelists and give them a round of applause.